Today I have the pleasure of speaking to John O, Sustainable Economist from the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. John, thanks for joining us.
No worries, thanks for having me on.
You've just released a report into electric vehicles on the market in Australia. What's happening globally and in Australia?
Yeah, so globally electric vehicle uptake has been on the rise. So there are around more than 26 million electric vehicles around the world, which might not seem like a large amount. However, when you look at, for example, the number of EV sales as a proportion of total vehicle sales, it is forming quite a significant number in certain countries. So for example, if you look in Europe, say Norway, EV sales form around 88% of new vehicle sales, or 54% in Sweden. And in places like China, EV sale as a proportion of new vehicle sales is around 29%. So those are quite significant numbers. When we look now into Australia, the numbers are lagging behind a little. So for example, last year, EVs formed 4% of new vehicle sales. But when we look this year, it is looking promising. June sales year to date was around 7.4%. Now, when you look at the fact that in 2020, EV sales as a form of new vehicle sales was less than 1%, you can see that that's quite a huge lift there.
All right, well, moving to the report, what are the main findings there?
Yeah, so we looked at EV uptake in Australia, and the main findings that we looked at were what are the trade-offs associated with purchasing an electric vehicle. So there were three main trade-offs that we considered on the driving range end, on the financial end, and the emissions end. So I could just walk through briefly what those are. So the first one is to do with price and driving range. So essentially, the more you pay, you're paying for bigger cars with bigger batteries, and therefore the driving range is going to be longer for those electric vehicles. So for example, the electric vehicle price range last year ranged from, say, Australian dollars 45,000 to $93,000. And for cars that were less than $50,000, the driving range was less than 350 kilometers. Now, when we compare that to electric vehicles that were priced higher than $64,000, the driving range there was greater than 450 kilometers. So when we look at EV sales last year, there was a strong preference for cars that had a longer range. So around 83% of battery electric vehicles sold last year had a range of greater than 400 kilometers. So that's to do with the driving range trade-off. And then the second trade-off we looked at, the financial trade-off, was that although electric vehicles may on average have a higher upfront cost, the operation cost, considering the charging cost, is lower than running a petrol car. And so it really depends on which vehicles you're comparing, and it can vary, but with some vehicles, it can take up to 4 to 6 years to recoup that higher upfront cost, or in some cases can take more than 18 years. So it really depends on the comparison there. And the last trade-off we looked at there was to do with the emissions. So the trade-off there is electric vehicles on average have higher emissions when the vehicle is being produced, but have lower emissions when it is being driven. So overall, results in lower total emissions, but there is a trade-off between production emissions and driving emissions there.
And in terms of your report findings, anything that surprised you?
Yeah, I think what surprised me was when looking at the emissions trade-off involved with an electric vehicle. So it's commonly understood that electric vehicles have zero tailpipe emissions, but what surprised me was that there were emissions associated with producing the electric vehicle, and especially the batteries, and also emissions associated with charging the battery electric vehicle. And so although overall electric vehicles will result in lower emissions compared to a petrol car, what's important to focus on would be the supply chain associated with the battery and the electric vehicle production, but also secondly, the rate of renewable energy within an electricity grid.
Well, John, a very topical space you're working in. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.